Hello, everyone, and thank you for taking time out of your day to join us on our monthly webinar. And this can be an interesting topic. This month's perspective is about big data, specifically tying this back to HR and then the value of big data, looking at things like predictive analytics. The agenda for today's talk is really about briefly what TrenData does in the space so you can understand our perspective, and then getting into big data. You guys have all heard the terminology of it, what it is, what it isn't, a little bit about evolution, getting into how we can use all this information in our daily lives, again, helping us around staffing decisions, staff management, recruiting. Brief demonstration of the tool so you can kind of see how we apply this in action, and then I'll open it up for Q&A. Special note, there is a chat window on the session, so as I discuss, feel free to go ahead and type in any questions you have in the chat. Jonathan's fielding that, and he'll be asking queued questions as soon as we get to that Q&A session. So from TrenData's perspective, we have a valuable solution in the marketplace. It's AI-driven people analytics. We do this in a cloud SaaS offering. We are sourced on AWS. This helps us quickly spin up our application so we can be up and running same day for our clients. We launched the company and our technology back in 2017, 2 years ago this month, and we are headquartered right outside of Dallas in Richardson, Texas. Here's a quick splash of a few of our wonderful clients today that are using our technology. Jumping right in, let's talk about big data. So big data perspective, you hear it all the time. You can now, there was a moment where even Googling big data was challenging to find a common consensus. But now Google has it built right into their search logic where it comes back. And it's really about accessing multiple types of information, as much information as meaningful. We'll talk about that a little bit in the coming slides. And really coming down to the purpose of what is the goal. So there's a lot of things around Google experiments you'll hear in the industry, what they allow the computer to just ascertain. Can it create artwork? Can it understand image data? But more corporate applied uses, we really look at this for solving problem. I have a problem around HR and talent management, and what information is out there that I can bring in and leverage to really peel back the layers of the onion and let me know some underlying causation of what's seeing, because we can't always see it from our specific position. And we have this neat little rule of thumb when we talk about big data. It's known as the V's. They're various numbers depending on who you talk to and how long you've been dealing with data management and big data in the industry. And it's evolving over time. The important thing is big data itself is not static. It just deals with the perspective of infinity. The more we can account for and the more we can compute, the more we can take into consideration. So every 2 days today, for some of you may have heard the fun fact, we create as much information as was created from the beginning of time to the beginning of the year. And that's just how rapidly information and data capture is expanding. And from that, how do we start using and leveraging this information? Correlating it to pieces. So I've got my work life, I've got my personal life. How much can I see of what's going on? And so we'll start with the first one. So the first one is volume. And these initial three are kind of Gartner's first three. So 3 to 5 years ago, they started talking about this rough concept of big data. And they came up with volume as kind of being the obvious one, which is take the amount of data that you can cognitively think of today that you may have in your BI solution, that you may have in your analytics solution, and just keep expanding and expanding. So there was a time when we talked about terabytes being this large amount of data, and Most people are out of touch with hard drives these days, but the consumer hard drive that you can put on a 3.5-inch form factor into a PC, if anyone still has a PC, is 10 terabytes today. So that's a lot of information. When I started in IT in the 90s, 10 terabytes was going to take up a whole storage array to get that much information, and now it's just on one drive. And so that's how quickly we expand. And so from that perspective, you think, all right, now I've got terabytes of information, I need to analyze that, and that's all past tense as soon as it's out there. So the future goes beyond terabytes and into petabytes and exabytes, which are the next big things coming. And that leads us to the next V, which is velocity. How fast this information is being created and generated out in the marketplace. So as I mentioned, every day, and in that, we've got 10 billion clicks in Facebook alone within a given day. And so, are we in the business of capturing all this data, or do we go through and we start sifting into the particular data we're interested in? And that's our third V of the initial 3 Vs, which is variety. So we take these, the volume, velocity, and the variety of information, and we end up with a common term in the industry, data lake. So this big pool of information, and we get into it, and we need to start understanding, how is this information related? What can I see in it? Back to that causation of trending and insight. And as I start to flow within things like media and media surges, can I then span out from there and look at, is event happening? When the avalanche happened in the Himalayas, and we heard about it first on Twitter from uplinks before the news had even broken that there was an avalanche. Speaking of Twitter, we've got 2 new Vs that have come into favor in the last few years. The first V is veracity, and this deals with the cleanliness of the data. So as we get into these Twitter streams, as we start spanning out onto LinkedIn, onto Facebook, and we're finding more and more sources for our information, one of the key things to consider here is, what is the quality or the validity of that data? Just because it's out there, there used to be a popular phrase, even the Colbert Report made fun of it, of wiki reality, which is anything you can put on the internet. If you can get enough popularity behind it, you can actually make it your own reality, because largely we trust volume of data. So the more we can validate a concept online by nearest neighbor and corroborating information, the more we give it in terms of statistical relevance. This comes back for those of you that understand anything about page ranking and how Google understands what pages and sources might be most closely linked to the question you're asking it in the query box. From here, we go into value, and this circles back to one of the initial points I was making in kicking off big data and big data projects, which is, what is it we're trying to solve? Just because we have all this information, just because we can go collect all this information, that takes time, that takes resources. Again, when you're dealing with beyond terabytes of data, it takes data storage capacity, whether you're doing it on-site or in the cloud. That is all direct cost. So we need to think about, there's only a couple companies out there like Google and Facebook and Amazon that are in the business of knowing everything they possibly can about you. And the rest of us in our day-to-day lives are really about, what problem am I trying to solve? So this value proposition is one of the key ones that comes back front and center for us, especially as we apply it to HR. Where do we go to find the best hires? From an employee standpoint, how do we understand engagement, and what is good engagement from what might not be necessarily productive engagement? Getting into forecasting and effects all of this may have on corporate revenue. All of this comes back into the value proposition for the big data play, and ultimately is why most organizations choose to put this V in front of all big data initiatives they have from a project planning perspective, which is I need to solve for X, all these other pieces come into play. And one of the biggest ones leading and circling back to the value proposition is the latest V. This one has popped up and is pretty front and center this year, 2019, with some of the latest big data blunders you may have heard of in the market. Amazon famously came out and published documentation that their staffing and recruiting bot was inappropriately favoring males over females. And they did a whole deep dive and published why in their study that unfortunately the algorithm was trained. These once you get a data set this large, it's almost impossible for a human. You'd have to have an army of humans to go through and sift the information. Amazon spent a decent amount of time looking at saying that you'd have to train these algorithms and validate them on past behavior. And unfortunately, their past behavior did lean towards hiring males over females. So the algorithm that came out of all this data that they had, unfortunately, had also learned their bias. That when it wanted to be correct, it knew historically that it could err on the side of males, and it would more often be in line with human perception and human agreement. And so this is the big one coming front and center, not only with really holding yourself accountable for past patterns and understanding that if in training data that those past patterns may come forward front and center, but also the all-seeing eye of the internet. Now that we have smartphones, we have social profiles, all of this can be brought in from data mining algorithms. What information do we really want? We can find ourselves in malpractice or liability suits if we have certain staff. In the medical space, this comes up where if you've got staff that needs to report to the hospital and your algorithm is collecting information that they've been out partying the night before, the due diligence you have now to divulge that information and actually hold staff accountable to say it's probably not in anyone's best interest for them to be working today in high quality fields. That's come up as well this year. So the two folds of virtue also tying back into value is what is it you're trying to solve? And now as you go out to get the information, really start thinking about what information you need, because all the information you can get is not necessarily the best solution for what you're trying to go after. Last but not least on this one, GDPR, from a European perspective, they've made it quite known that there is a separation between professional and personal data rights. And if people personally want their data expelled from a system, they have the right to request that. And so that ties back in of what you're using. If you're not collecting the information in the first place, then you're not having to answer requests like that on the back end. So it can save you from the project management and construction of what you're going after big data. It can save you a lot of headache in terms of where you're going. So tying this all back, I'll put to my thoughts again. So from the big data and the HR, one of the first things any project starts with is the what we like to call here intelligent data gathering, which is just looking at the multi-points of connection, the information you can acquire, and how to bring it in to a central repository for analysis. So from an HR perspective, the big three we go after initially are what kind of HRIS, regular talent data do you have? From a finance perspective, what can I get from payroll? And then talent management, what can I bring in terms of any kind of recruitment or targets or performance information? And so from there, we get a pretty good picture. Now, one of the things I always touch on, questions come up of how much information do I really need to get started? So there's a lot of information that's available out there, and big data isn't necessarily an internal perspective, right? So internally in most organizations, especially when it comes to HR, there's a few exceptions out there where they do have quite a bit of information, or they've just kicked off projects like I'm going to forward all my email through a central aggregation server, and now I can see anything and everything that's going on within my organization. It's a lot of variety to sift through. But from a more purpose-built approach, when we come through these cores, we can really say, what do I have that I can start with? We don't need everything, and we can span out from here. So maybe you just have payroll information, and payroll is a great place to plug in and say, okay, from that payroll feed, I know lots of information about my staff. I know their home address because we're sending that check somewhere or we're sending a W-2 somewhere. So I can start calculating things like commute distance, because believe it or not, commute distance and gas is starting to matter to employee bases. And so when you look at retention scores, depending on how far staff is commuting day to day, how bad traffic in your region is getting, that matters. And so from there, you can start to spider out and look at what information is publicly available. So you have third-party benchmarking information, satisfaction surveys, not only internally but externally, getting some standard information. And this comes back to regional information. So as we start working with more and more clients, we realize that from a traditional way of thinking in business, your competition is the business that you compete with in your sector. And that business may be headquartered on the other side of the country. So you're not too worried necessarily in terms of who's going to go where. But from the new market perspective, and the skills and the fact that we have a constrained talent pool in most markets, your new competitor is also the business right down the street from you. They may not be competing with you in deals on the front end, top line revenue for sales, but they're definitely competing with you on talent. And if they have a similar stack that you do, and their business is growing, they're going to start offering better benefits and better work-life balance packages to try to entice staff to come work for them. And also an interesting note there, when you look at these job boards and the big data there, and kind of coming back to virtue, as we look in these models, and you'll start hearing more and more about the accuracies of models and what we think we want and what we have a computer tell us. And we all come up with our 10 features and the ideal candidate, and the computer goes out to try to find that ideal candidate. But fun statistics behind the scene are these bots actively troll the top 20% of the talent pool. And that's the talent pool that actually matches what everybody says they're looking for. There's two types of mismatches out there. There's one of the employee not fitting the requirements, but the other mismatch is the company looking for someone to fill a position and then not being able to fully engage them. So you say you want a data scientist, for example, but you don't really have a workload. Your workload really is geared more towards an analyst. And so if you do hire the data scientist quickly becomes bored with the work. And not only is back out there looking, but back to these bots that are actively grooming the top 20%. He's constantly being inundated by job offers from other employers because the bots constantly stack rank him at the top of the list. So these are some things in data efficacy, culture management that you'll hear on other webinars and podcasts out there in HR Today, just about how big data and all this automation actually has a dark side, back to that virtue V. From here, we have a big data lake and a lot of information to sift through. And how do we go about finding what we're looking for? And one of the things we bring into the picture that you see everywhere else you go, Google, Amazon, is the natural language processing. I don't want to be able to, or I don't want to have to rely on an IT analyst all the time. Where is it that I can just come in and ask the system a simple question and have the system understand what my intention is and then respond to me with relevant information. We see this in our voice assistants today. What they're really doing is starting to tie the metadata between what you say, what you mean, and what information is most likely going to fulfill your request. And from here, we go the next step out in terms of the question we're all really asking in this big data play is, where are we going, right? We're looking for this mystic ball in an ideal world I want to be able to see in the future. So the real purpose isn't just to have the data. That's very expensive. And isn't just to mine the data. That may be telling me things I can't change, like I want to see what happened in the past. It's good historical study, but it already happened. It's very difficult to undo that. And the real reason you're looking for this information is to then extrapolate this and apply it forward so that you can get some predictions. And we've all had our Excel spreadsheets in the past, and a lot of us still use those today because they're easy to explain. Those use very linear projections. So they just take what I'm doing and continue to push it out. And then my boss may tell me to go ahead and apply 10%. So they've got an artificial growth curve to that. And we now have a trajectory to shoot for next year. And at the end of the day, we all know it looks good on a billboard, but there's very little confidence in that number. We've done it to push an initiative. The predictive modeling we're doing with big data and data science is really trying to get us back to that North Star based on what we see, based on what we know, factoring everything like competitive growth, economic growth, people moving into my town, moving out of my town. Where do I see my business going, and how do I staff accordingly? So do I need to stay flat because business might be flat? Do I need to grow because there's huge demand? Do I may need to think about reduction in staff because we're just not seeing things? Maybe there's in some metros they're losing talent, and we're losing talent, and there are things outside of our control that we just have to accept. We can't necessarily mitigate on. And so from here, we consistently analyze this data over and over. So as soon as we model it, it's history, and it becomes yesterday's prediction. And then we run it again today, and it becomes today's prediction. We run again tomorrow, and we do another level of machine learning on even the trending information and the initial modeling information to see, based on this, it's called profit forecasting, not profit as in money, but profit as in prophecy. Profit forecasting, and it's heavily used in the market today. One of the most famous uses of it is Cambridge Analytics, in terms of how you can rig an election, and a lot of the data science they use to accurately target the people that they were able to sway. And the way they're able to do this is just to consistently crunch information and cannot come up with key indicators that are letting you know something, whether it's a person, whether it's environment, whether it's an employment situation, is agreeable to outside efforts. And that can be incentive packages, that can be compensation, that can be work from home policies, may even be things like work-life balance. So we take this and we go to that next level of, based on what the data pool and the analytics can see, what becomes the computer recommendation in terms of, there are all these things that come into play, but these are the ones that have the most statistical relevance. And we'll get into some specific examples of this here in a moment. So coming back to mining this big data trove. So wherever you are in any kind of data project you have, maybe you don't even call it big data. Big data has some interest to you. But a lot of times, right, when you think about the terabytes and terabytes, and we just sit down and I can pull my extracts in flat files, and it may just be 30 megabytes. So it seems to pale in comparison to some of these big stories you read about either online or in the news in terms of how much information is being gathered. But from the business-to-business approach and what it is from a purpose use scenario, it's more about the types and what we're doing with it and where we ultimately want to go. So we have our data lake, no matter the size. And what we really want to do is get into visualization on our side. So this is really step one, whether you're in the market or whether you're here at TrenData. Rows and rows of data, they just go by the wayside. There's nobody with enough time anymore to analyze columns. And so the first thing we need to do is we need to get this in some sort of visual representation so you can actually understand and see where that data is taking you. It may be megabytes of data, it may be terabytes of data. If it's in a workbook, you really can't see the difference. And as soon as you put it front and center and you get your chart, you can immediately read, is my chart going up? Is my chart going down? Depending on which chart I'm looking at, is that a good thing or is that a bad thing? From there, how do I really drill in? Once I see something, essentially looking for the stoplight, right? Everything that's green is good. Everything that's red, I need to click on, metaphorically. We have lots of colors now. But once I see a red indicator, how do I start clicking in and drilling down to understanding some of that core data? So I'm not having to sift through troves or pages in a workbook. I can go right to the subject information of what it is I'm concerned about. And now aligning and correlating of the events and trends. So I may see a reduction in staff, and as I look through it, maybe we had a merger last year, and through that merger, maybe we had a staff reduction in the coming months. People may have liked their previous position with the previous employer, and now that we've merged, they've chosen to leave the organization to go pursue other ventures. And it's important to keep that in perspective, because we either made a decision or we accepted some realities. So there might not be anything we want to do about this information. So just because your trend is heading in a certain direction doesn't necessarily mean good or bad. It just means there's cause and effect. And last but not least, modeling. This becomes more important and more the way we're going in the future, which is rather than a shoot from the hip that we keep saying, we have to all start learning to trust data. And that gut is a terrible way to go, but yet every day in business, we see it all day long. Everybody trusts their gut. The data gets overwhelming. And then so this is where we like to bring in modeling scenarios. What if you can then take that crystal ball of all these algorithms that have been running in the background and start to model what happens if I pay you more? What happens if I give you more flexibility in your workday? What happens if I put you in more development programs? And not just taking that gut feeling, but actually looking at market data, actually looking at employee data, actually looking at benchmarks and comparative analysis, and understanding where we may be underperforming the market, to which anytime we can rise up to meet the market or be more hospitable to a particular demographic, definitely comes into play to help balance things out. But then what kind of balance am I going to get, right? Is it, if I'm dealing with a 5% turnover, is it going to drop me to a 4% turnover? Is it going to drop me to a 3% turnover? So just where, back to that value, right? Where do I want to invest my efforts so I can get the best return on my project? So a quick example, it's a lot of information, a lot of slides to throw out. So I want to bring it back to some practical applications to help drive this home as we go through the second half of the webinar here, is that all this information happens day in, day out, and most people aren't really aware it's going on in the background. So a quick example here, and for fun games, you can fire these up and play with these on your own. But now today, a lot of us are used to putting in specific things, specific places they want to go to, but back to the natural language processing, back to being contextually aware. You don't have to do that anymore. You can go into Google, and Google immediately knows where you are. It's got location information, and you can type in something, I'm hungry. And it's interesting, I didn't try that here, but I'm pretty sure that would work as well. And I just put in, places to eat. And then on places to eat, it recommended where to eat near me. So I said, yeah, that sounds good. Let's look at where to eat near me. And based on that, it's bringing up restaurants near me, but not only restaurants near me that I've either searched for in the past, that I've given some sort of preference to, or that based on what Google knows, Google thinks I may be interested in some of these restaurants. And of course, the paid promotion. So for restaurants that really want to try to get on the map, they can pay a little extra to be promoted and show up in people's search history. And so this really starts driving, not only answering the question, but then driving behavior as well. Back to that virtue part of you really got to know, because there might be other businesses here that now aren't getting foot traffic and maybe going out of business because Google isn't modeling them. So analytics can work for and against you, and it's important to understand those models behind the scenes. So a couple of quick examples as we bring this again back to HR are things like, what's the average salary for a vice president? These might be things you've got in your organization. You want to understand what you're paying, because a question may come up and you may want to know what you're paying versus what a competitor or another business down the street is paying. We also quite frequently want to know things like, what's the average time to fill an open position, right? So staffing requirements. I've got a new rec coming up. Business is moving fast. how quickly are we going to get a qualified candidate in this position? Is that 45 days? Is it 90 days? So now we can begin to plan as an organization. Where do we go for that hire, right? Just because I've got a hire right now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's the best source. So where do I want to look, and where do I want to invest my market spend in terms of recruiting and outreach? And then one of the key ones at the end of the day, turnover rates for high performers, right? We all have turnover, but as we dive in and how do we start dissecting that information, I want to know specifically those people that I really, really don't want to lose these people within the organization. And how do I start honing in and understanding what's going on with them? And then as we'll see here in the next couple of slides, like what I can do about it and how we get into the modeling pieces. So leading us to the next question on this example, how do I retain more high performers, right? First, I understand the turnover rate. And what I'm really after is I want to know my retention strategies, right? And so then, systems are pulling out. This specifically is our system. But similar to Google, we're going in, we're analyzing the information, we're understanding what it is you're looking for. And in this instance, on the left side of the graph, is the historical information, and on the right side of the graph is the predictive information. And so it's showing on the left side that yes, we do have a problem where our high performers, the percentage of our staff that we'd most like to retain, the turnover is increasing. And when we look at it in terms of what it is, between exit surveys, between comparative information, between all this information we can gather behind the scenes, where it is that is driving this, with the key factor, right? Lots of things drive it, but when you look at statistical populations, you usually get out to a few outliers. And in this instance, we see one clear outlier, which gets to the professional development scores, right? So the system is seeing that this example is investing less, about half, in professional development as to their market competitors. And that by increasing and improving their professional development, in this case going from 6 to 12%, you can immediately have a drastic impact on retention of those high performers. And even better, that impact is retained over time. So you're continuously driving down that turnover. From here, we'll jump into a quick demo so you can see some of these pieces in action. Get off the slides for a little bit. See some things that are a little more interactive here. So this is the TrenData application. And what we've got here is some model data loaded and back to the point of all the data you can have and how you want to look at it and readily digest it. We break things down into tiles to give you nice visualizations to show you what's going on within your organization. And to go further, we set up multiple dashboards. So you can make these tiles nice and big. You don't have to have crowded tiles, things above the fold or below the fold that you constantly have to search for. You can go right in and specific purposes get right down to the information. So let's pick on retention, as we were talking about that in actually recruiting in the model, and want to look at things like sources of hire and some of the ways we can tease out quality information from the data we have. And so if I jump into something simple like sources of hire, and from here I'm just looking at every new hire we have and going through and looking at how we source that new hire, and I get a quick chart over time, and we've got an outlier that jumps up front and center, and we can see every month the leading sourcer of employees inbound are our job boards. And so this is where, taking the big data approach a little bit beyond where analytics and BI goes, it becomes really important and relevant to the future. So from a traditional strategy, you'd have your spreadsheet or you'd have your BI tool, and we'd say, okay, this is the statistical relevance of sourcing candidates through job boards. So now as we look at our spend going forward, a dollar spent on job boards yields us X. And that looks really good from that straight line analysis. But when we open it up and we start setting different views on the data, so we can real quickly come in here and let me just switch to high performers and we apply this information. Now we get a different view of the data. So every once in a while, we get lucky and we've got some job boards that stick up. We can see that a lot of the times we've got this pink bar, either leading or being present in the pack. And so we know that we've got a lot of LinkedIn leading here. And so previously it may have been lost in the minutia, but now we can go back at the data and say, okay, once we spin that and look at cost, and now we aggregate that by performance, we begin to see that it may be a longer source to go through LinkedIn. It may be a little bit more expensive. It may be a little less expensive. But the yield to the business, when applying things like, first year of an employee is largely a sunk cost. And we really want to get around retention and performance. And so the return on investment for LinkedIn sourced candidates begin to outweigh other sources in this example, of course. So everybody's data and how it goes through and starts dredging up insights. We kind of say culture is one of those fickle things where everybody has a culture. It's interesting to try to match it and try to find people who are going to thrive in your specific culture. And that's where analysis like this can really come in handy to let you know that for what you do, this is where you want to go to find the candidates you're looking for. So now that's inbound. And if we come into the high performing scenario and turnover scenario, so we can see our rolling 12-month perspective on turnover. And so this is in the organization. And real quickly, this is, again, a straight line analysis that just lets us know how things are coming in. And one of the splits we like to put on this, and there's lots of splits we can do. You can see from our list here, any information you give us, we can come and give you a split access, and then we can continue to dive in from there. But first and foremost, back to the previous example, is by performance, right? So we've got high performing turnover and we've got non-high performing turnover. And it's important to trend these individually because non-high performing turnover, depending on the industry, may just be something that we tolerate. If it's low skilled work versus high skilled work, it can have different impacts. But generally speaking, the business is able to tolerate a larger degree of non-high performing turnover than it is high performing turnover. And so trends where you start to see as what's happening here in the data in September, where our high performing turnover is getting to the point where it's close to matching non-high performing turnover, really gives organization a cause for concern to say, what is it we want to do about this? Because the high performers are usually our deal closers, they're usually our senior leads within teams. And with behavioralism in the workforce, once you lose senior staff members, we all kind of know we lose additional staff members with them. Kind of like the leaders and the followers on Facebook and LinkedIn. Everybody tries to go out for those trendsetters so they can get the pack to follow them. So if I quick jump into the predictive model here, you can kind of see a little bit about how these models build and structure. And so again, on the left side, you've got the historical, and on the right side, you've got the predictive. And what the algorithms are seeing in the background based on public information, historical trends, is that turnover is going to peak at almost 6%. And at that point, 6% gets pretty rough for turnover, and it's going to taper off. And the good news is it is going to decline over time. The bad news is it's not going to decline by much. And that's assuming static situation. This is if we take no action and don't do anything about it. And so I'll get into our modeling tool here. I'm going to bear with me on the fonts. Sometimes it's hard on a webinar to get everything to fit into the screen, so it might get small for a moment in time. I'll shrink this just another hair. And so let's look at back to that modeling point on the earlier. So we have the data. It's not necessarily what we have in the data, what we can see in the data, but now what we want to do about it to really drive that value home. So I've got a few indicators here in front of me with common reactions to turnover. So first and foremost, a traditional knee jerk is, okay, I'm losing people. I want to retain that. Let me throw some money at the problem. So I'm a 1,000 employee company. I want to think about a $5,000 raise across the board to try to help retention. It's a $5 million investment. So there's a lot of things I can do with $5 million. So if that's my budget, modeling is very important. Again, I want to get back to that value of what's the biggest, let me see if I get my cursor in the right spot. What's the biggest return on investment? And so I can see here that simply throwing money at this situation, and for those of you that are up to date on current HR, people management, we know money doesn't necessarily solve all problems. Definitely a lot less than it used to in prior workforce generations. It's currently ranking around 6th on employee retention in terms of things employees care about. So it really doesn't, and I'll get into this a little more here in a second to help you dig in and understand why, because our tool also helps you understand the questions. So the interesting thing here is it's just saying, okay, we need to check out another model in this situation that money saved me about 0.2% the very first month and didn't do much after that. So one of the other things we grapple with today is work-life balance and work from home policies. And so everybody seems to be going the work from home route. So I can go ahead and jump in and say, okay, well, working from home, maybe they don't like their commute time. So let's go ahead and jump this up and look at an extra 10% or so on letting people work from home. So I take that from 33 up to 45%. And at the top, this looks pretty good. I've immediately staved off my turnover trend and reversed it. So I'm bringing things back to healthy levels. But again, the data can be misleading depending on how you're looking at it. We're looking at it by totals right now. And if we flip this over and start looking at it by performance, what we're seeing is that that was heavily biased by non-high performer turnover. So the aggregate. And staff isn't staff across the board. We really want to start honing in on certain populations. And so that work from home policy had an intended target. Unfortunately, that intended target in this model was the non-high performing staff. And so it drove all staff down overall, but we can still see that non-high performing retention is now exceeding high performing retention rather. And so back to the value and the purpose of the project, what we set out to do was to target high performing retention. So in this scenario, we really didn't meet that target. People aren't leaving as quickly, but unfortunately, we're still losing the people that we want to keep. And so now we come down to the professional development. And we look at that, again, 6% going to 12%. And now this will drive back to the chart from the presentation. And what it's really showing is that on parity in the workplace, we weren't investing in our employee development. And employee development matters. And you'll see it starts to drive. High-performing individuals want to be on high-performing teams, want to be working with employers that share the same sentiment as they do and that want to invest in them just as much as they invest in you. So a little bit of a long answer for that scenario. But that's where you're seeing on the benchmark data now coming forward that once we're able to meet parity in the marketplace, we're able to retain that specific population. So coming back to the pay question, everybody always likes coming back to the pay question of why not give bigger raises. So we can come right into the NLP here in our application. Sorry for my acronym, natural language processing, for those of you that are new to the phenomenon and aren't quite with the algorithm lingo. But it really understands the purpose, right? So if I'm saying why not give bigger raises, there's some context in here. It understands I want to know about pay. It understands I want to know about market performance and some parity. And I'm asking the system to help me answer a question. And so the system is going back. It's looking at the information. It's taking what it thinks I'm looking for, and it brings me this chart. And what it's done in this example is it's broken up my workforce by job level, and it's looked at benchmarking information for my industry and my region. And it's showing that across the board, we all are already as an organization paying at or above industry compensation. And so to translate this back into modeling, if we're already paying people more than they can make elsewhere, they're not leaving for salary per se. You may have a few outliers that are leaving for salary, but the majority of people are leaving for another reason. And so statistically, salary has low weight to retention in this model. So we need to look at the other factors that are going to have greater rate on retention when answering that question. So with that, I spent a lot of time in the application. I don't want to spend all of this. You can certainly request a demo, and we'd be happy to go through more of those scenarios. I just wanted to use that to help bring clarity to the whole big data, and not just collecting the information, but what you can do with the information once you have it. Jump back into the presentation here. And let's go to some Q&A in the last 5 minutes of the webinar. What do we have for questions rolling in, Jonathan?
All right. Thank you very much, Andrew. So I got one direct question, and they say, how much data would we need to get started?
So one of the big pieces here, and we get this a lot. So you talk about big data, you talk about these leading industries, and you go, okay, I understand what IBM is doing, and I understand what Oracle is doing, and I'm not a 100,000 employee company. I'm not even a 50,000 employee company. Maybe I'm just 2,500 employees. And I don't know where to go. I have the same problems they have. I have some retention issues, and I have some things I need to get on top of. So can I use a tool like this, or what does big data serve for me? And going back to the data aggregation slide here, let me just quick exit this show. And sorry, my jump didn't pop up on this display, and come back in. We can cross leverage a lot of information. It doesn't have to be internal. We can bring in external information as well, back to the survey and publicly available information. So when we get to the intelligent data gathering, maybe you just have a spreadsheet, and that's what you do today. You have a report that kicks out. Maybe you don't even have an HRIS system. You've just got an internal database somewhere where you're tracking this information. That's enough. Don't discount that information. Maybe it's just payroll. We're a trusted partner with ADP, and there's a lot of things we can pull out of just payroll data, back to commute times, back to start dates, seniority. There's a lot of things we can trend for you in that data. So I always say whatever you have is probably enough to get started. And even as you go forward in your data journey, a lot of times you come up with, what question do I want to ask next? And so to really get to that, to the answer to that question, you need to understand what data you have now and how it can be used now. And so you say, we just don't have the data, we just don't have the data. I've worked with a lot of clients, and rarely do you actually not have the data. Usually it's in a terrible format, or it's on a file on somebody's computer, and you don't necessarily have access to it, or it's not clean enough, that veracity component. What can we do to clean up the information? And so there are lots of tools available out there that you can use to clean your data, validate your data, bring it in, and back to that visualization. So the first thing is establish a benchmark, even if it's just yourself, and say, here's what we have, here's what we can now visualize. And from there, you begin to understand questions like, okay, I have a web-based learning and development tool, and I know they have an API, and I can get that information. What if? What if I were to look at that on employee performance with compensation and now tie in maybe some revenue information, because we've got some top-level financial company performance data we can bring in. And now back to the correlation and causation. Am I seeing trends? And from those trends, am I able to distill out? And even beyond, I always say I in that scenario, just everyday talking, because we still tend to think of ourselves as we're the decision makers. But beyond what I can see, what is the computer able to tease out? Those algorithms that consistently run in the background, what are they seeing that I may just see as seasonality? That it's able to give me some advice or some recommendations on where to go from here.
Thanks, Andrew. So do you have any good recommendations for salary benchmark sources?
It's just a base level for salary benchmark. You've got, depending free or paid, first of all, right? And I'm a big fan of what you can get without having to pay a subscription to. So you've got Bureau of Labor and Statistics. They publish a ton of reports, and you can always reach out to us if you want a list of those, and we can get you a list. You've got Equal Employer Opportunity. I always get the acronyms backwards between Equal Employment Opportunity, Equal Opportunity Employer, EOE. But they publish benchmarking information from the information they collect. So you can start to see where employers are going in terms of diversity at work and programs like that, and creating better culture. From the paid side, you've got salary.com. There's also Robert Half has an annual survey that's out there. So depending on how crisp and how recent you want your information, Bureau of Labor Statistics does it quarterly. The Robert Half survey is annually. So it's out there and you can find it. You just determine what velocity matters to you.
So just a comment first. Roberto says that Price Waterhouse provides that information in his market.
Oh.
And then subsequent to that, he says, according to USA and European standards, big and middle-sized companies are quite different to those we might find in Latin America. Is it still applicable to this market?
Yes. So I would say the cause and effect, the drivers and the response, it's multi-factored, which plays really well into big data, or again, not even if it's not big data, but big data from the perspective of data analysis. How many factors can I bring in and look at my given situation? So even if let's take the perspective beyond size of your business. Let's look at metro. So you got top 15 major metros in the United States, and then you go outside of major metros into more rural economies. And you look at it, there are different factors, absolutely, but you need to be able to tease those factors out. So when you look at, for instance, hiring specific skill set, you need to know what's the talent pool you're picking from and what's the demand for that talent pool. So whether I'm in Dallas, whether I'm in New York, whether I'm in Silicon Valley, yes, we have a larger pool. We also have a lot more companies fighting for that pool. So now you roll out to smaller metros. Maybe you're in Des Moines, Iowa, where it's big in insurance there. So even though it's smaller population, and they have a talent pool, they've got a large, from that specific scenario, they've got a large talent pool of people that understand insurance business and finance as well. And there are a couple big players there in those markets. And so what are the fringe areas? So that's what the major drivers are. Now you apply that to your business. Maybe I'm in manufacturing. So you look at it, okay, it's not a hot industry in Des Moines per se. I don't know this for fact. I'm just creating a scenario for discussion. So it may not be a hot environment for manufacturing, but then again, it's got a captive workforce and there's not a lot of demand for it. So just because there isn't a large pool doesn't mean that's a bad scenario. If there's not a large demand, that means two things. One, you can go in and there's staff ready to hire. And two, there's less contention for your staff. Back to those AI models that are constantly going out there and constantly inundating your staff with, wouldn't you like to know what you could make working somewhere else? Well, if there aren't a lot of direct competitors for your labor force in the immediate area, that creates an advantage for you as an employer.
Absolutely. Thank you, Andrew. So last but certainly not least, here if we already had an analytics tool in SAP, what value would TrenData add?
This is another great question that we get quite frequently. So with every mainline tool you get, it seems that they all include their analytics packages today. So coming back to this intelligent data gathering of connecting multiple points. So how available is your analytics package today? How open is it to bringing in third-party data? Can you bring in other benchmarking data other than necessarily preferred vendors? Can you bring in your learning and development? Can you bring in things like Google Maps to weigh not just commute distance, but in some areas, I lived in Philadelphia for 6 years, and 6 miles in Philadelphia proper was about a 30-minute commute. So you got to factor the relation in, right? 6 miles in Philadelphia is not 6 miles in Dallas. So the commute time is very valuable when you look at your workforce and how long they're spending in traffic, back to that work-life balance. So you look at that analytics tool and you say, okay, from the big data perspective, how much third-party information can I bring in that's going to help me solve my problem and understand what's going on within my workforce and what's going to help them be more happy and fulfilled employees within the organization. So that's that first question. And if there are limits, anytime there are limits that pop up and you can't get to it, or there isn't a good interface to bring it in, or you need an implementation analyst and you just can't afford enough implementation analysts, that's really the premise of TrenData, as we just wanted to try to liberate the data, make it a lot easier for you to get to by being a hub for all sorts of not only third-party databases, but even third-party analytics tools, so we can take what they have and then augment it with additional information to make it better.
All right, well, that does it for the question and answer portion.
All right, wonderful. Well, we are at 2 o'clock, so filled my hour here. Thank you, everyone, for joining the call. Let me get our jumping around on my slide deck. I'll get you to the closing slide for additional information and where to reach out if you have additional questions. And again, we do this monthly, so please check our board and come back next month and see what we have to give to you, and reach out if you have any questions in the meantime. Have a great day.